Okay.
Yes. Though I see his point in dividing thinkers into these two groups, the hedgehogs and the foxes, I don't. I'm not inclined to categorize them so rigidly into two groups. Uh, he wasn't. He didn't see them as rigidly defined, but he impressed upon the readers the need to recognize those two positions, extreme positions. Perhaps you could say that this was a pedagogical need perceived by him. I tend to see a greater diversity, which is implied by his pluralistic approach, but not perhaps sufficiently realized in his own historical writings. At one point, I think I even used the expression that political thought was chaotic as a reflection of politics, that politics was a chaotic field. Now, you could rephrase it and say that people's choices have always been different. So you could say that as a matter of strict theory, I agree with him here, but as a matter of the reality that I try to capture and convey, I'm more Berlinesque than Berlin. I try to capture and convey greater diversity than he does. I suppose it's the opposite of what often happens with pupils. They become more rigid than the teachers. Perhaps I wasn't sufficiently a pupil of his, but I do somehow see a greater diversity of humans. Another aspect of it, my view of history is much narrower than his. He embraced the whole Europe and even in the United States to some degree. My view is much narrower. I concentrate on Russia. And looking at Russia, I think I'm more inclined to see Russian history as thinking of historians of Russia we know, more like Mark Rayev, for example. In that I probably see more of the positive and valuable aspects of it than he at least put in the writing. As I say, it may be partly an influence of Oakeshott's, and I haven't finished talking about Oakeshott. We may return to that writings, but not only that. It's the evidence that one encounters. I tried to put my own thoughts together in that piece on the choice in Russian history. Incidentally, I think I promised you to give you all those recent articles of mine. Haven't done so, but I shall make a copy of the present state
okay.
of those.
Good.
Yes, I mentioned Herzen. Perhaps he wasn't quite so interested in specifically Russian things. Russian thinkers for him were fascinating by themselves, but he was always interested in deriving general lessons, as it were, from reading Herzen, from reading Tolstoy, from reading Turgenev, and so on, rather than concentrating on the specifics of this or that thinker. And then, of course, he concentrated his attention, with very few exceptions, on individual thinkers. Even his famous article in Foreign Affairs, Generalissimo Stalin and the
art of
the art of government, the art of government. This was perhaps he was perhaps thinking of the art of government rather than of Stalin at that point. But even there, it's Generalissimo Stalin and the art of government rather than, let's say, the communist regime. I don't distinguish policies from politicians. I mean, I don't think of policies as something platonic. But I'm interested in policies as well as in the underlying.
Well, in
ideas.
general, you're not as exclusively involved in the history of ideas as
Yes,
he is.
yes. That's what I suppose what I'm trying to say. Although there is very little that I've written about besides ideas.
Yes, that's correct. That's good.
I don't know if that's an answer to your question.
Fine, no, it's
Would you like to go on talk about Michael Oakeshott now, or talk about Berlin or
Michael Oakeshott.
childhood?
Well, let's Michael Oakeshott finish with.
all right.
At that point, when I first met him, my English wasn't really adequate, so I frequently had to say what I had to say in German. But he understood German, and I understood English sufficiently. So sometimes it was two languages simultaneously. He soon after that he was elected to a chair at the LSE to succeed Lasky in the chair of government, and there was a sort of what do you call it, the old-fashioned clocks, the
Pendulum.
An extreme left-wing position of Lasky, and then the pendulum moved, and then again back after Oakeshott, it moved in the opposite direction again. When Leonard Shapiro decided that I had been long enough outside the university setting and arranged for me to an appointment at the LSE, we were both, Leonard Shapiro and myself, were both technically subordinates of Michael Oakeshott. He was the head of the department, and we were both in that department. And there I met him on several occasions. He used to come to Shapiro's seminar, so that not every time, but so frequently, and so that was an occasion to talk. And sometimes I talked to him in the common room or in his what we call office. When it occurred to me that I could make use of all those that work of mine on the history of political thought in Russia and give a course of lectures there. I don't remember actually whether it had occurred to me first or to Leonard first, probably to me, but I immediately discussed it with him, and he was in favor of it, and he first spoke to Oakeshott about it, and then we discussed that, and Oakeshott was strongly in favor. Excuse me. There was friendship with Michael Oakeshott. I knew him reasonably well, but our conversations were never private, as it were. We were never, unlike Isaiah Berlin or some other people, it was always either practical matters of the department or the general views. He was interested in my comments on various Russian things, and I was interested in his in what he called the historical mode of experience.
Mm-hmm.
That was a point in his thought that I caught on.
Did it shape your understanding?
I'm sure it did to some degree. I was always, I remember, I was always anxious to avoid what appeared sometimes in his writings as almost a quietism, a fatalism. His objection to radical changes was so strong that at least in his writings it could be perceived as quietism, as an advocacy of passivity, which was belied by his own activities. He was a very eloquent spokesman for an active opposition and representative of an active opposition to those activities which he opposed. So it was interesting for me to ascertain the meaning of these and to relieve my own anxiety that he might be too inquietist, too inadequate of passivity rather than an active active engagement. That's just about all. He was a very nice person. He very different from us. Both very nice. He spoke slowly, deliberately. The similarity in the speech was that both were involved. Berlin's sentences. Someone wrote about the cadences, Russian cadences. I'm not sure about that, but Berlin's, sometimes you would find the whole page being one sentence in Berlin. Now that wasn't the case with Michael Oakeshott. His sentences were shorter, but they were tentative, mild. His favorite term was intimation. He himself would also produce intimations rather than assertions. That was typical of his style. He would. I think he published a small book, the Voice of Poetry in the Conversation of Mankind. This sort of approach, not a tribune, not an agitator.
Mm-hmm.
It was always, and so I had grown up under Stalin in the Soviet Union. I had been familiar with the Russian polemics. I then spent several years in Germany. Again, you had to bombard, you had to hit your listeners on the head. And I remember I tried to do that in England. It took me some time to grasp the English understatement.
Well, what year was it that you met Oakeshott?
1950.
Oh, the same.
Yes. Or possibly early 51, I don't remember that.
Mm-hmm.
But soon. In 50, it must have been 50 because he was still in Oxford. And he was elected to the LSE, to that chair at the LSE, I think in 50, 51, something soon, very soon after that.
And your conversations with him in London, though, were later?
Oh, that was, that I can pinpoint exactly. 57, 62, during those 5 years, 57 to 62.
Okay. Should we turn to something else now?
Sure.
We're on.
No, questions.
Oh, well, going back to the beginning, to your family background.
I see. I think my family background was rather interesting. My parents were both Russian, but from the Volga area, where it is impossible, even if it were theoretically possible, to find pure lines anywhere. It would certainly be impossible in the Volga area to find any pure lines. They were both mixed. My father was probably, oh, I can't be sure, he probably had a Moldovan admixture. He was born in a village that, according to the people who study place names, has a Moldavian name, and there are some other reasons to think that he probably had that admixture. On the Great Russian side, I think the family origins were probably in Pskov. My father never mentioned that. He probably wasn't aware of it. It's simply my conclusion. On the one hand, I found that there is, or at least was, a village in the Pskov Oblast called Utechina, деревня, not a selo, that is a small. And those small villages there were usually named, they were very small, 2-3 houses, that was the village. They were usually named after the peasants who had founded those villages. So it was probably peasant origin in Pskov. There are other linguistic reasons for me to think that they were probably descended from Pskovians who at some point were either went themselves or were resettled in the Volga area. He, on his father's side, there were several generations of clergy. I don't know how many. I don't think my father knew how many. There wasn't any talk of any non-clergy ancestors on his father's side. His father wasn't actually a priest. He had been educated at a theological seminary, which was a tradition in those families. Apart from anything else, when the church lands had been confiscated, secularized by Catherine's government, the government undertook as a kind of compensation to educate the priest's children, both sons and daughters, free of charge at the church schools. And so it was the obvious thing for them to do. But my father's father, my grandfather, married early, and my father was born, and my father's mother died. And he remarried quickly to have a substitute mother for my father. According to the rules of the Orthodox Church in Russia at that time, he couldn't be ordained, even a deacon. He was married twice, even if as a widower, he could not. So he wasn't even a deacon, let alone a priest. He was just a chok, the church servant of the lowest level. But they still technically belong to the estate of the clergy. So my father was educated at church schools, the Духовное училище, primary school, and then the seminary, secondary school. But it was somewhat more than a secondary education, because it included the professional ecclesiastical education, as it were. And they usually graduated slightly later. Well, of course, there were lots of them who were grown-ups. You probably read Milovsky's Bursa, that church school is depicted. This wasn't the case in my father's time. By that time it had been reformed, but there wasn't so much obscurantism and punishment and pranks among the students themselves. But it was the family background and his education that led to the formation of his outlook.
You feel he had a decent secondary education?
Certainly.
Yes.
Well, in some respects. In some respects. On the one hand, excellent Latin, Greek, and Church Slavonic. He told me that they had started studying the Latin grammar before the Russian grammar. So that gives you an idea of how upside down, as it were, it was. But they had to be able to recite prayers in Greek, for example, and not just in Russian or Latin, but on Czech Slavonic, I mean, and Latin, but also in Greek. The Lord's Prayer. I almost remember it in Greek. This was the intellectual milieu, as it were, in which his education took place. On the other hand, Hebrew and modern languages were optional, and he didn't take any of those. His eyesight was bad even then, and he didn't take any of it. So education, I said, a reasonably good education, but I have to qualify that by saying that he had no modern languages and no Hebrew. His Latin, on the other hand, was so good that when we came together to Oxford in 1950, he was almost completely blind by then, but he insisted on going out for walks on his own. And on one occasion, he one of the very first attempts of his to walk, he lost himself and didn't know where to go. And I don't know the details. I don't remember whether he approached a young man or a young student. The young man turned out to be a student, and they conversed in Latin, despite the difference in pronouncing Latin words. They were able to understand each other somehow. That's an example of my old father, on the one hand, was still able to converse in Latin, and the Oxford student whom he just met in the street was able to converse in Latin. Moreover, was able to understand what my father, with his Russian pronunciation of Latin, was able to say to him. And that student then directed him, or perhaps brought him to our flat. So, and constantly images, sayings of various kinds, biblical, evangelical, ecclesiastical, were constantly on his mind. Not at all necessarily in in a religious or ecclesiastical context, but simply I realize now that the imagery was so rich that one could have a worse intellectual media than that. But it was constantly there. The church Slavonic quotations, biblical quotations in Church Slavonic, Latin proverbs, they were constantly there. I remember many of them now, to this day. So that and then my father was a very good student at the seminary, and the teachers wanted him to go on to the academy, to Kazan. That was in Simbirsk.